Thank you all for coming. Welcome to Brown Bag Lit. I'm Brown Bag Lit co-founder Chloe Elena Miller. Shasta Grant and I first conceived a Brown Bag Lit late last year, and we started classes and readings in January of this year, 2023. Today, we're happy to welcome you to our final event of the season to hear Jolene McIlwain read from and discuss her new short story collection, SIDLE CREEK, which came out yesterday. Thank you to everyone who's been coming to our events since January, to our classes. If you've missed one, you can find recordings on our YouTube channel. We hope you'll join us for a future class or reading. We'll be announcing our fall classes this summer. There is still time to register for our summer residency. It's an asynchronous class that will last 3 months. You'll receive weekly prompts, one-on-one meetings with either myself for poetry or Shasta for prose, as well as personalized feedback in response to submissions. We'd love to have you join us. There's still some seats available. All of our details are on our website, brownbaglit.com, and I'll be putting all the links into the chat in a moment. Please note that the deadline to register for the summer residency is Monday, May 29th. So on to today's show. Please make sure that you stay muted during the reading. I recommend that you put the screen on speaker view for the reading and gallery view for the Q&A, which will happen afterwards. Do keep the chat open to ask questions, follow the links, and share anything that you like about the work while we hear Jolene read. Our brown bag readings are free. We hope you will buy the author's books, of course. We'll put some links in the chat. And now I would like to welcome co-founder Shasta Grant to introduce Jolene.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm so excited to have Jolene with us today. This has been in the works since January, so it feels like a very long time. We've been waiting with great anticipation for SIDLE CREEK and for Jolene, and we're just really, really excited that you all could come and join us. Jolene McIlwain's work has been nominated for the Pushcart Prize and appears in numerous online and print literary journals, including West Branch, Florida Review, Cincinnati Review, Craft, Smokelong Quarterly, New Orleans Review, Litro, and more. Her work was included in 2019's Best Small Fictions Anthology and named finalist for 2018's Best of the Net, Glimmer Trains and River Styx contests, and semifinalist in Nimrod's Katherine Porter Prize and 2 American short fiction contests. She's received a Greater Pittsburgh Arts Council grant, the Georgia Court Chautauqua Faculty Scholarship, and Tinker Mountain's Merit Scholarship. Her debut, SIDLE CREEK, out with Melville House this week, received a starred review from Publishers Weekly, and Shelf's Awareness calls it a riveting debut collection and a rare gem, a compelling blend of nature and humanity, perfect for fans of Barbara Kingsolver's Prodigal Summer and Daisy Johnson's Fen. Ron Rash, bestselling author of Serena, calls SIDLE CREEK one of the best short story collections he's read in a long time. Also like to add here that it got a really great review on NPR today as well. Jolene's taught literary theory analysis at Duquesne and Chatham Universities, and she worked as a radiologic, I don't think I'm saying that right, Jolene.
Radiologic
technologist before attending college. BS English, minor in sculpture. I'm fascinated by this. MA in literature. She was born, raised, and currently lives in a small town in the hills of the Appalachian Plateau in Western Pennsylvania. Welcome, Jolene.
Oh, thank you so much. I've been really looking forward to this. And thank you too to Sarah Littman. Shout out to Sarah, because I loved seeing Sarah's wonderful moments in time with you guys here back in January, whenever that was. I love Sarah, and thank you, Sarah, so much for keeping me from going out of my mind. So I'd like to start with a piece that is really special to me because it's a very short piece. It's called Drumming, and it actually is one that was published at Cincinnati Review. And it's the one that my agent found me through. She had read it online, and because Cincinnati Review does this wonderful thing where they put hyperlinks in your bio, she was able to read a lot of my other stories because I didn't yet have an author page. And Cincinnati Review is just one of the most wonderful literary journals out there, and so supportive to new and emerging writers. So I wanted to read Drumming first. Drumming. Dusty Sinclair plunged both of her hands in the steaming liquid, felt the slick softness of the bleached water on her fingers. She wrung the rag, slid it over the counters, nodding, smiling, nodding, while Albert chattered on about the men in the green trucks, the wells they were punching into the ground all over the valley, about how he worried their drilling might spoil the SIDLE. Do you think they'll convince anyone else to sell? She asked, turning to meet his eyes, knowing he likely wouldn't answer or even look at her. Albert's eyes met no one's since the incident. He talked a lot sometimes. The only way people could tell he took in what they said was if they watched him count the syllables of the words as they spoke. Marcellus, Utica, what's the difference? She asked, watching him tap 3 times for Marcellus, 3 for Utica, twice for difference. She smiled. I mean, difference, she repeated. He tapped 3 times, letting a tiny half smile itch his cheek. Then he pulled out his notebook with his only hand, held it down with his stump, and jotted something. One's deep under the other, he said, quiet as pie, and smiled full at his writing. She stood there in front of him, watched him pull his wallet and change from his pocket, and he placed the exact amount on the slip and situated $2 in the menu holder for her. They'd been in the same study hall their senior year, where he'd often tap out drum solos, pretending he was Neil Peart or Phil Collins. She went on to see him at the hospital after his stepfather took a buck knife to the tendons of his wrists for practicing too loud. The restaurant had just cleared from morning rush. She'd have time to schedule with her doctor. She'd have time to go out back for a smoke. She could hear the dishwasher clanging pans and dishes, water spraying against stainless. She could hear the UPS truck pulling in across the street, the dogs at Herbie's junkyard sounding off their warnings. She could hear the sweet trilling of the kids at the elementary school outside for gym class. Hysterosalpingogram, she said. Albert's eyes glinted toward hers, and he tapped the counter 5 times before she slid her hand under his finger. That's what they want me to have next, Albert. He tapped gently on the softest part of her palm once, then again. She should have been telling her husband this, or her mother, or her best friends. Infertile, she said. Feeling him tap her skin 3 times, her throat stung, but she kept going. She closed her eyes and said, empty. He tapped twice. I'm so sad, she said. He tapped slowly once, twice, then again. When she opened her eyes, he was staring right into them. And I wanted to say something about that piece because it includes the word hysterosalpingogram. And a lot of times in workshops, when I would add medical terms to my stories, people would say, do you think you should define that term? And I thought, I'm not going to define it because anyone that's gone through infertility treatment might have heard of that procedure. That's something that they do with women who are dealing with infertility. And I had been involved in several hysterosalpingograms as an X-ray tech, but then, also I was worried about having to have one done when I was dealing with infertility myself. So I thought, no, I'm going to leave that word in there. And it was one of the things that the people at Cincinnati Review particularly liked, that language was in there. And it's so melodic, medical language. I mean, even the worst words like carcinogen, or melanoma, they sound beautiful and they're horrible things, but I think they can find their way into our writing, and it's not always a bad thing to put them out there. The next one I'm going to read is Oiling the Gun. And this one found its beginning in a Kathy Fish Fast Flash class. Kathy is just, if I hadn't been in Kathy Fish classes, I wouldn't have had at least half of the stories that are in this collection. So I wanted to do a shout out to her. She's been a wonderful mentor to me and an amazing instructor and teacher. This piece is called Oiling the Gun. And it's also a part of a novel project that I'm working on, but it's somewhat autobiographical, but the father in this piece is not my father, but it's based somewhat on my father. So, but you'll see that I'm kind of aged myself with this piece because of the music I mentioned. That's okay. So it's called Oiling the Gun. Ashes dangled on the end of Gwen's dad's cigarette. He squinted his eye as smoke drifted up. Tips of his fingers were slick with oil. The rifle lay on a bath towel on the green shag living room carpet, where one night before Gwen's cousins slithered disco moves to the Bee Gees' Night Fever. This late afternoon, no music, news yammered low. That story again about President Carter's daughter, Amy, and the elephant. A year before, Gwen had been so envious of the girl and the baby elephant named Shanti she'd received on behalf of the children of America. Gwen would never touch that elephant. She'd begged to visit their local zoo, but her dad said zoos were horrible places. Keep beasts too far from their own ways of being in the world, makes them all kinds of crazy, he'd said. The news now explained the story of Amy Carter and the runaway elephant spooked at Ethel Kennedy's home by a barking dog, almost stampeded Amy. The Secret Service saved her. Gwen's dad turned around quick to see the screen. He shook his head. He'd loved JFK, hated Carter. He snapped his fingers to get Gwen's attention, threaded a cloth patch through the cleaning rod, slid the rod up through the barrel. The fawn chamois across his knees was stained with black hashes. She pushed closer so her knees were inches from the towel. Tomatoes cooking down in a bath of basil, oregano, garlic bubbled in from the kitchen. Gwen's mom scraping the pan's sides cut scratches in the sound of her humming gossip to Aunt Ramey. She peeked in to see Gwen was far enough from the gun, stretching the phone cord until loops were near straight. Gwen's dad was chatty, as always after a hunt. 3 purpled squirrel bodies had been soaking in the sink, simmered in the sauce. They'd have spaghetti. She'd pretend again she wasn't hungry. He explained the rifling, how careful one had to be with that rifling when cleaning the gun. His cigarette danced. He set it on the ashtray by his knees, picked up the gun, stared into the muzzle end of the barrel. Gwen gasped a little, eyes wide, a grin pushing at her dimples. Her gut dizzied. Don't hurt to look down at when it's empty, he said, but you never should. Gwen bit the inside of her cheek. She didn't want to hope the gun would go off, a bullet forgotten in the chamber. She didn't want to wonder what the house would sound like without him, if they'd sing louder, with more harmony, or if singing would stop altogether. After all, he was the best wailer of Hank Williams' long gone Lonesome Blues. She didn't want to wonder if her brother would finally sleep sound instead of waking in the night, sleepwalking outside to check the beagles. He'd always made sure their dad hadn't beaten them for barking, for waking people who had the early shift. Would her brother be less or more skittish as the sole man left in the house? She needed to get away from the gun, from all the possible worlds it offered. She tried to push her mind away from her house in the slip, to think about only nice elephants, about strong arms of the Secret Service who could lift you from any danger, about girls with fathers who had more choices than her dad could ever have. Gwen got up, walked to the kitchen, sniffed the sauce, poked at the meat with the spoon, watched it come loose from the bone. Okay, so this next one, I wanted to mention something about the last one. When I said it was sort of based on my dad was, this working class guy, Teamsters truck driver, and he did have beagles and he did train them to hunt, and they were champions and he bred them. But he also would get very angry if our dogs would bark at night. And very upset with the dogs and sometimes banged the cage. And I felt so bad for the dogs because they were penned, you know, they were kept in these horrible pens, I thought, but they were nice pens considering the kinds of pens they should be, because after all, they were champions. And my dad did take really good care of them, but he was always concerned at night that they would be barking. It wasn't until years later that I realized that some of the things my dad did had everything to do with his working class upbringing, because the biggest problem in our neighborhood would have been if his dogs would have kept his friends up late at night when they had to get up at 3 a.m. to go to the coal mines, or 5 a.m. to start their first run with their trucks. And so it would have been the worst thing in the world to have your dogs keep your friends up so that they couldn't get to work. So I found that years later, I finally realized what that was about. And I didn't realize it really until I was in Kathy's class, because she had us start with a memory that triggered our pieces. And that was one of the memories that did. So thanks again, Kathy. That was like a therapy session. I'd like to read Angling next. Sometimes we've been told in workshops that we shouldn't ever write a story where a person wakes up in the morning or looks in the mirror at themselves or has a dream. So I was playing around with breaking that rule. And in this story, my character wakes up in the morning, looks at herself in the mirror, and she thinks of a dream. So here we go. And this one's called Angling. And this one, yeah, it's special to me because it has a little bit to do with a friend of mine who had died young, who was also an angler. His name was Jack. In this piece, the friend's name is Van. Angling. She woke one morning after a dream about her fisherman friend Van, who died too young, with the sensation of a hook snagged on the inside of her cheek, close to her lip. Like a piece of fishing line attached from her, drooped mouth to him wherever he lingered now. Her son didn't catch it at first, and when she slurred, "Does my mouth look right?" he answered, "Yeah, you look fine, Mom." But he also wrinkled his brows and turned to his father, saying in a tone she rarely heard now that he was growing into a man, "Dad?" Her husband worried she'd stroked. Her father had one, and her grandfather, grandmother, and 3 uncles. He called 911, promised he'd be right behind her, and before they lifted her into the ambulance, he kissed her good side. The doctor assured, "It's not a stroke, it's temporary." "What about my eye?" she asked. "It won't stop crying." He marked with a lopsided star excessive tearing on the list of symptoms he handed her. 2 weeks, you'll be back to normal. But she knew what happened. Van had caught her again, just when she thought she'd been healed of him. And she peered out the window as her husband drove them back home along that winding, flooded creek bed of the Seidel, where she'd once talked too much and spooked the rainbow and brook trout, sending them into deeper runs. Had Van used a dressed treble hook meant to lure her with its flashy feathers, or Siwash meant to leave her less damaged by his memory, or jig hook to ensure the set? She could see his smile, his eyes almost touch his fingers again as he crimped 5 split shot to the line to weight it down. After the 2 weeks her doctor promised, her face righted, and Van's face faded again, rippled back to blurs, cut deep in a back cast, tangled in a tree she couldn't find. I have one more, just a very short beginning of one of my pieces that I wanted to read because, again, it's always interesting to try to break rules. And so I did a lot of that in this collection. I have one piece of the very final piece of the collection that uses present tense, past tense, future tense. And I think for the first few times I sent it out, I think editors actually thought I didn't know I was making that mistake, quote, mistake. Anyway, so I tried to break some rules with this. And one of them I wanted to break was in the less said. And it's a story about some haunting, weird thing that happens in the middle of the woods. And in the story, I don't really get into telling the reader exactly what happened. It's called The Less Said because of the phrase, the less said, the better. And it's told in multiple points of view. Another thing that sometimes people frown upon in short stories, they want one point of view. I use several points of view. But anyway, this first part of it has very, very technical language, and it sort of talks around what happened. And that's what a lot of the sections do. They talk around what is actually the event, because that's how things happen in small towns and everywhere. You know, rumors are little tidbits and you just have to put it together. So this is called The Less Said, and it originally appeared in the New Orleans Review. And for this collection, I more than doubled the size of the original story that's online. So I'll read the first section of, I believe there are 10 or 12 sections. It was a simple pulley, not weathered, maybe fixed eye, with some plastic twine threaded through the sheave. It hung there from a bar which had been bent in the middle by weight and poor planning. The bar was secured to two trees about 5 feet apart, wispy-looking Quaking aspens with trunks about as big around as an average female's thighs. Smooth like them too. Other than that, in the hundreds of empty bullet casings scattered about and piled up in mounds, it looked like any other rundown ordinary camp. If they were true hunters, they would have recycled their casings instead of wasting them. These guys wouldn't take to sizing and primers. They wouldn't deburr, bell, chamfer. They wouldn't know what a carbide die was. True hunters would have had a proper gambrel hoist for the deer they hung. They were weekenders. That's if what they hung on that pulley was a whitetail. That's if that's what they crept into the woods to hunt. And I'll end there.
Thank you so much, Jolene. Absolutely beautiful reading, beautiful stories.
You know.